Session 3, the mission continues. We're shifting to a look at how the world was transformed in the post-war and how the United States took on its new role as the world superpower. So, a new world order in U.S. post-war responsibilities. To chair this session is a friend and advisor to the museum. Dr. William Hitchcock is the James Madison Professor of History. He also serves as Director Governing America in the Global Era. His books include The Struggle for Europe, The Bitter Road to Freedom, and The Age of Eisenhower. Now, Will has served as a presidential counselor to the museum in the last number of years, and as such has really performed yeoman service. I am told, even though it's before my time, that he gave one of the best talks at our international conference in his opening keynote in 2019. So there's no pressure, no pressure for him to, do a repeat performance. Actually, there is. So to chair a new world order in U.S. post-war responsibilities, it's my pleasure to give the stage to Dr. Will Hitchcock. Will?
Good afternoon, everyone, and great to see you back for another terrific round. I'm Will Hitchcock. I teach at the University of Virginia. I'm thrilled to be chairing this panel on a new world order and post-war responsibilities. We're going to focus on the United States and the transition from war to the post-war period. So it's a nice pairing. We've had a Europe-focused panel and an Asia-focused panel, and now we're bringing it to the U.S. I don't want to read the bios that are in the program of our three distinguished panelists today. You should read them because they're so long and so detailed, and it would take me a long time to get through it. But I want to give you the biggest broad brushstrokes. Before I introduce the panelists, I do just want to say, the amount of work it takes to put this all together is staggering, and the staff is so fabulous, and they're so able and friendly and wonderful, and I just admire how hard they work to bring us all together. It's a real honor to participate in it. And I'll just name the leaders of the whole outfit, Stephen Watson and Nick Mueller. You guys have just created something magic here, and we're all very grateful to you. I also want to thank you because you have come here to learn and to engage with us as historians. And I don't have to tell you that history is embattled in some ways these days. And for us to have the chance to talk to you about your interests gives us the feeling that our work matters. And I think it does matter, and you think it matters. And so thank you very much for coming here and demonstrating your passion for learning. Well, our all-star panelists, I just want to, let me just say one thing. Pause for effect.
More later.
Yeah. I want to hear your thoughts. These are three of the most influential and accomplished historians in the United States, full stop.
We should stop there. Don't say anymore.
I should probably sit down now, but I will just introduce them. Blanche Wiesen Cook is the Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at John Jay College and the Graduate Center of the University of New York. And she's a major scholar in many fields, from the fields of war and peace studies, U.S. foreign relations, women and gender. She wrote a wicked book on Eisenhower that came out in the early 80s. That's terrific. She is, of course, the leading biographer of Eleanor Roosevelt. Her wonderful 3-volume history is unsurpassed and will never be surpassed, I don't think. She's also a public voice. She's been an activist, an outspoken leader of opinion, a broadcaster, and perhaps most important to wonks like us, she has done a lot of hard work in prying out secrets out of the U.S. government through the FOIA work that she has done, using the Freedom of Information Act to make the government show us what they're up to. So we owe her a debt of gratitude for her scholarship, but also for that work as well. Next of our trio, Jeremi Suri. He holds the Mac Brown Distinguished Chair in Leadership and Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin. And he has written on an astonishing range of topics, from American democracy to the role of the presidency in U.S. government, He wrote a wonderful book on Henry Kissinger, and Jeremy has been doing an enormous amount of media lately about Kissinger and his legacy. And he's written on America's role in the world generally. I also just want to point out he's an award-winning teacher. That's something I know that matters to him a lot. You know, we love to write books, but our job is actually to teach young people, and Jeremy is one of the great teachers and mentors in the profession. Our third speaker, Lizabeth Cohen, is the Howard Mumford Jones Professor at Harvard and a Harvard University Distinguished Service Professor. Her work on the post-war United States has been among the most influential scholarship in the profession. Her work has addressed American urban history and suburban history, the politics of consumerism and capitalism, the history of the New Deal. She has won countless awards and honors. She has held numerous leadership positions at Harvard. I will just say she is the winner of the Bancroft Prize, not once, but twice, unless there's a third one that's already come that I didn't know. But that is the most, you know, for the best book in American history in the entire country. She's won it twice. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a panel of royalty in the history profession, and I'm thrilled to introduce them. We're going to speak on, you know, the New World, post-war themes, and there's an awful lot to say about it. I'll just say, in my own view, the keynote here is that victory in World War II for the United States represented in many ways the fulfillment of an argument. And that argument was first introduced by Franklin Roosevelt somewhere around 1940. And it was essentially a view that American democracy could not survive in the world as long as fascism, Nazism, and Japanese imperialism existed. That was a hard argument to make in 1940, but it was vindicated in the Second World War. American democracy could not survive, and democracy anywhere, everywhere, would be extinguished if fascism and Nazism persisted. Well, that's a very ambitious war aim. And the question that we're going to be addressing in our own various ways is, did the United States live up to those expectations? Did it fulfill those ambitions? What role has it played in the world since? You know, if we lived up to that ambition of a new world order, what were its characteristics? Did we live up to the four freedoms? And if so, why? And if not, why not? What did all that sacrifice and effort that that Americans poured into the victory to win victory, what did it yield on the other end? How did it shape Americans' understanding of our own role in the world? This is a question of terrible importance today. What do Americans believe about our role in the world? And is it connected to the legacy of the Second World War at all? And how did waging a total war change American society? It changed it radically, dramatically. Our economy, our culture, our daily lives were changed. So these are some of the huge topics we're going to address, and I'll invite Blanche Wiesen Cook to kick it off for us. Thank you. All right.
I'm really profoundly moved to be here with this wonderful group of amazing people and this fabulous panel. And this is the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And Eleanor Roosevelt had a little bit to do with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and her entire vision. And I'd like to start by reading from a book she wrote in 1940, Democracy and the Moral Basis, the Moral Basis of Democracy, in which she sets up the words that ultimately she uses for the rest of her life. This is from 1940 on, and it's her answer to fascism. And she says, for democracy to survive, we must live cooperatively and serve the community. For our own success to be real, we must contribute to the success of others. And she says, while the ideal of democracy is very real, if we are honest with ourselves, we will acknowledge we have not carried it out. and in our lack of faith, we have debased the human being. We still have slavery in different forms among different groups. We have yet to accept the brotherhood of man as a basic truth. The 130 million people who make up our great nation come from every nation on the globe: Asians, Africans, Europeans, Latin Americans. We are truly the melting pot of the world. But we have allowed a situation to arise where many people are debased by poverty or the accident of race in our own country. It is often said that we are free, and then sneeringly free to starve. That is not an amusement. Nobody can say the Indians or Negroes of this country are free. Racial prejudice enslaves, and poverty enslaves. 1940. She goes on, just a little more. Some of us have too much of this world's goods, and we are thereby separated too widely from each other. We are separated so widely, we fail to appreciate the sufferings others endure. And then she gets to the point. Political democracy requires economic democracy, while greed debases it. Either we must make our economic system work to the satisfaction of all our people, or we will fail. We must achieve an economic level below which no one is permitted to fall, but we have not yet discovered the secrets of full employment. And too many people are left with nothing to do. And so she goes on, we need to have a new spiritual concept to define democracy. We have been too devoted to the gods of mammon. Humanity must rise above purely selfish interest and take responsibility for one another. Democracy involves the spirit of social cooperation. In this era of catastrophe and danger, E.R. said, change requires a bold new vision for the future that will transform our whole attitude toward life and civilization and motivate us to seek a new world, a full responsibility for the well-being of the whole people. And she concludes, E.R.'s radical definition of democracy was service for all, and her definition of neighbor was global. We are many, we are everywhere, we are all connected, we are all. 1940, and it's that vision that is found in the United Nations. And the United Nations was created after World War II to ensure peace and provide the essence of freedom all around the planet. We are all neighbors, we are one. Then, and I'd like to go into Eleanor Roosevelt's chair of the Human Rights Commission, 1945. She's in London. Truman has appointed her a US delegate, and I have to get to, it's very hard for me to see, so if you can just bear with me. Okay. Thank you. At the first session of the United Nations ended. ER was very optimistic. The first session, 58 nations were united. The US was not a member of the League of Nations, but the US was active at the United Nations, and Eleanor Roosevelt really believed that a new world could be formed. She was unanimously elected chair of the committee that founded the Human Rights Commission. And she was part of an extraordinary team that agreed the first project would be to write an international bill of human rights with John Humphrey, Canadian international lawyer, P.C. Chang, a Chinese scholar, playwright, musician, leading diplomat, Lebanon's learned Dr. Charles Habib Malik. And it was this leadership group, subsequently joined by France's René Cassin, who had spent the war years in London as Charles de Gaulle's legal advisor. By 1947, Cassin and ER supported, and then India's Hansa Mehta. India's Hansa Mehta led the unfinished ethical agenda of our time before the world, and she was president of the All India Women's Conference and a leader of the independence movement, the only other woman on the commission. And it was ER's steadfast personal diplomacy that helped ensure the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights on 10 December 1948. And this is all, if you want to get the details, it's all in volume 3 in my book. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which begins, all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights, and everyone is entitled to the political and civil rights of speech and economics and the economic and social rights, 22 articles, actually 30 articles, and there were 2 covenants to make it binding, but Eleanor Roosevelt said this would be a vision for all nations to follow, and it has become a vision for all nations to follow. And in the post-colonial world, most of the post-colonial nations have adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the essence of their constitution. And it really is an extraordinary fact. It was not binding, but it was to be a vision, like the Magna Carta, like the Constitution. And it was much more than that. But to make it binding, there were to be, Eleanor Roosevelt agreed that there should be 2 covenants because she knew that the US would never ratify and make legal the economic and social rights. So there were 2 covenants, civil and political rights covenant and the economic and social rights covenant. And from 1948 to 1966, the covenants were worked on. They weren't introduced until the UN voted on them in 1966. They were ignored, and the US has ignored one might argue the US continues to ignore the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but they were officially ignored until Jimmy Carter, as president, signed the covenants in 1977. And then on the 8th of September, 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush actually presented the civil and political covenant to the Senate, and it was ratified. And so we are a party to it. However, the US has never had even a conversation about the Economic and Social Rights Covenant, which I think is rather extraordinary. In 1961, John Kennedy reappointed Eleanor Roosevelt to the United Nations, and really the last things that she continued to do before she died in 1962 was to urge Americans to fight for the UN and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here we are, how many years later? 40, 50 years later. She wrote a book called Tomorrow is Now, which was published 3 months after her death, in which she said, with proper education and a sense of responsibility, we will understand that the welfare of the world as a whole involves us all. If we do not cherish and honor the word free, and we do not cherish and honor our sense of democracy, it will cease to apply to us. And Tomorrow is Now, she wrote that social change required ideas be faced with imagination, integrity, and courage. The influence you exert is through your own life and what you become yourself. And here we are, more than half a century later, and Eleanor Roosevelt, who believes someday poverty will be replaced by dignity and respect, and we will unite to save our small, blue, endangered water planet, which we all do happen to share. And here we are at this fabulous meeting. Courage can be as contagious as fear. We might unite to make it all possible. Thank you. Is that all right?
It's hard to follow Eleanor Roosevelt and Blanche Wiesen Cook, but I'm going to try. I want to begin by just joining Will's comments and thanking our organizers. And in particular, I want to single out my friend Nick Muller, who's sitting here in front. Let's give him a round of applause. Many years ago, Nick called me and persuaded me to be a counselor here on the advisory board, along with Will and a number of other historians in the audience, and it's really been a great joy. I have certainly learned more from the museum than I have contributed, and I thank you for that opportunity to keep learning and to be a part of this wonderful conference. I'm going to talk today about how the United States is transformed in its policies, foreign policy, but also domestic policy, because we know those are interrelated, how it's transformed by the Second World War and the New Deal. I think we have to put the New Deal and the Second World War together in many respects. It's hard to disentangle them. Think about, for instance, the GI Bill, which of course is a World War II measure, but echoes so many elements of the New Deal. So if we think about the World War II New Deal era, and think about how different the United States looks after the war from the way it looked before the war, and how different American policy looks after the war from before the war, I think we might call World War II the Third American Revolution. The Third American Revolution. If the Civil War is the Second American Revolution, James McPherson has written beautifully about this, World War II and the New Deal might be the Third American Revolution. Incidentally, that's a phrase that Henry Kissinger uses, and I've been talking a lot about Kissinger the last week. He is, of course, one of the most famous World War II veterans. It is World War II that makes his career. If you want to read more about that, you can buy my book and read more about that. But what World War II does, among many other issues, is it creates, in essence, a new constitution. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, our Constitution is rewritten, and it's rewritten without new amendments after World War II. I will say more. Our politics are different, and boy, is our foreign policy different. The end of World War II is the end of anti-militarism in the United States. The end of World War II is the end of isolationism in the United States. And the end of World War II is the end of unilateralism. Anyone teaching U.S. foreign policy from the revolution, the first one in the 18th century, through World War II, as I do, builds your course around isolationism, unilateralism, and anti-militarism. And almost overnight, they're gone. Now, they might be coming back in our own time, and we might want to think about the hazards of forgetting the history of the last 70 years. But I think that's for another panel, maybe our round table tomorrow, or maybe hallway conversation. Let's start with the end of anti-militarism. One of the central tenets of the American Constitution is that the United States will be a non-militaristic republic. There is very little space, if any at all, for a major standing military in the US Constitution, which is why, at the start of World War II, the United States is ill-prepared militarily for the conflict it is getting into. By the end of World War II, though, as a consequence of the necessary, heroic efforts of Americans of all kinds, men and women, African American, white, Latino, Jewish, to build the largest, most effective global military the world has seen to that time, as a consequence of that, the United States is a transformed state. It is what historians come to call a national security state, which it was not before. And this has really made part of the law of the land as fundamental as any law in 1947 with the passage of the National Security Act. It is the National Security Act that converts the Office of Strategic Studies, that everyone knows here, the precursor to the CIA, into our permanent intelligence establishment. It is the National Security Act that creates our Joint Chiefs structure, which had de facto operated under George Marshall's guidance during World War II. It is the 1947 Act that creates the Secretary of Defense's office, right? The Constitution very intentionally separates Army and Navy. The founders were very concerned about a unified military establishment. There is a Department of War, and there's a Department of Navy. Please don't ask me why there wasn't a Department of Air Force in the Constitution. I have received that question from audiences. The National Security Act of '47 does de facto what Roosevelt had done during the war. It unifies permanently the American military establishment. Ladies and gentlemen, there was not a single founding father, not even Alexander Hamilton, who thought that was a good idea. I'm not saying it wasn't a good idea in '47. It was necessary, but it is a fundamental transformation in the way our system operates. It, by the way, provides the basis for some of the most important early civil rights gains in the United States. It is because of a unified military establishment that a single executive order, Executive Order 9981, in July of 1948, from Harry Truman, is able to actually desegregate what is at that point now one of the largest employers in the United States, the US military. A fundamental transformation. It is building on the war production executive order non-discrimination going back to 1941 and 42 with Franklin Roosevelt. So our new unified military establishment means that the politics of Washington are fundamentally different from what they were before. If you were in 1920, someone trying to get policy made in the United States, for the most part, the military was not a major political actor. By 1947, 48, there's almost no policy issue. Civil rights to international defense, for which the US military is not a significant element and a major political player in Washington, D.C. It changes everything. It's the basis for the United States to have the resources, the capabilities, the ambitions to be involved around the world as it was not before. On the eve of World War II, the United States has about a dozen countries in which its military forces are operating. After World War II, and for the next 5 decades, the United States will operate military forces in upwards of 35 countries, and that's undercounting the non-military military activities, which is to say, the not discussed military activities in various other places. It's a fundamental shift. There really isn't a part of the globe a decade after World War II where there is not an American military presence. And that was entirely unthinkable before. It changes the nature of presidential power. As Will kindly said, I've written a book about this. Presidents before 1941 had almost no authority to send military force abroad. The presumption was that if the United States was to fight a military engagement of any significance and any length, that Congress would be required to declare war, which is what we do in 1898, which is what we do in countless occasions. Even in many of the Caribbean conflicts that the United States is involved in, there's congressional authorization. The Platt Amendment is one example among many others. Post-World War II, presidents will have the capability to send a large standing military to various parts of the world with limited, if any, congressional approval. And we will develop a norm in the United States of congressional non-comment, non-voting on these issues. This is, if there is such a thing as an imperial presidency, this is the most obvious example of that. And then the management of the US nuclear arsenal. Obviously unthinkable before World War II. The American nuclear arsenal is managed by one man in one office, the executive president of the United States. He is not just the commander-in-chief, he is now the man who has the keys to the nukes. The amount of power that an American president commands at his control. We wonder why people around the world are often concerned about American power. The strength of this system is that it's a system that allows the United States to mobilize and deploy force effectively and fight multiple wars in multiple parts of the world, sometimes quite heroically. At the same time, the peril of this system is that the United States is fighting wars in all parts of the world, and that there is limited public oversight and even less public consent. This is a problem Lyndon Johnson confronts, but it is only the result of 20 years. It is not the beginning of that problem. American doctrine for foreign policy, this is my second area, the end of isolationism, really falls under the category of containment. If there's one way of understanding how the United States thinks about its use of force and influence, it is to contain the spread of communism. And communism is vaguely defined as Soviet or Chinese or Cuban. The long telegram written by George Kennan from Moscow in 1946 provides the basis for thinking about containment, but it is, of course, the Truman Doctrine of March 1947, which articulates a commitment unthinkable 30 years ago, that the United States will provide support to virtually any regime fighting communists. That the United States will provide support to those who are fighting the new fascists who we see as communists. This brings the United States in the defense of fledgling democracies in Greece and Turkey. It also brings the United States into the support of dictators around the world. One of the questions my undergraduates always ask, I love teaching undergrads because they ask the best questions, is why did the United States support so many dictators? It's a long list, ladies and gentlemen. It's not clear the alternative was better, but it is a long, hard question we need to ask ourselves. From the Shah of Iran through various dictators in Latin and Central America, through various dictatorial regimes, even, to some extent, one could call South Korea in the period before 1950 a virtual dictatorship of Syngman Rhee. How is it the United States finds itself supporting these dictatorial regimes? It is our commitment to support virtually any regime that is fighting communism. It makes it difficult for the United States to disentangle its anti-communism from its sometimes support of profoundly anti-democratic, horrible, brutal, human rights violating regimes. This is a difficult problem the United States has. I put it to you not to criticize or condemn, but to point out how difficult it is. As Henry Kissinger says, in the world of I should do it in his voice, in the world of international politics. In the world of international politics, you don't get to choose your partners, but the powerful country providing aid should have some choice, shouldn't we? We should have some standards. I would argue it's hard to maintain those standards. It was much easier before World War II than it is after the war, and our record is mixed at best, a record that we still have to grapple with today. The third area, perhaps the most profound, is the end of unilateralism. We've talked about the end of anti-militarism, how militarism becomes central to our politics and foreign policy. The end of isolationism, how international containment becomes central to our policy. The end of unilateralism. From the time of the Revolution until World War II, how many alliances did the United States join? Anyone want to answer? Zero, that's correct. Zero. We have an alliance with France during the Revolution, and then we sell them out. We basically violate our own treaty with France to sign an agreement with Britain, and we never form an alliance again. We did not even ally with the Allies in World War I, right? We were an associate partner. Wilson was very clear on that. We did not join alliances because the American conventional wisdom was that the old corrupt world was a world we should not identify or legitimize, and that we should maintain our ability to make our own decisions. That changes fundamentally in 1949. Yes, we're part of a grand alliance during World War II. That's seen as a temporary measure. The United States helps to build in 1949 what becomes the longest-standing, most successful alliance of the modern world, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which, get this, ties American security to the guaranteed defense of each member of NATO. So, Finland has just joined NATO, which I think is a good thing, by the way. If Russia attacks Finland tomorrow, we are under treaty obligation to defend Finland. I can't tell you how unthinkable that was to anyone in American politics in 1925. That would have surprised even Franklin Roosevelt. Why is it that the United States made this shift? I think there was a fundamental wisdom that came out of World War II that a generation of Americans had, whether they were Democrats or Republicans. And I'll be honest, a bit of wisdom I wish we had today, which was that as powerful as the United States becomes, it cannot address the problems of the world alone. The lesson of World War II was the lesson of jointness, of working with other societies. Not all other societies, but even working with the commies, right? Even working with Stalin, even working with Franco, even working with Vichy for a while. We don't like to admit that, do we? Even working with Ho Chi Minh in certain ways. That for international order, for change, and even for some element of democratization in the world, the United States needs allies. And that the United States needs something it had not given much attention to before, diplomatic capabilities. People who are trained in foreign languages. After the war, most of our foreign language programs at all of our universities were created by government money to train young people to be prepared to be diplomats, to work in other parts of the world, to understand the history of other countries, funded also by the US government after the war, to have citizens prepared to work in those countries. That's one of the reasons we have the GI Bill, to send middle-class Americans to college to do this. NATO is part of a fundamental shift in American thinking about the world, where the United States becomes more powerful, more involved, but also more committed to cooperation with the good guys, whoever we think they are, or the less bad guys than the bad guys we are fighting against. This is fundamental to a shift in US thinking. And it is probably the most striking reason why we might say today we confront the possible end of the post-World War II order, the Third American Revolution. Are we now no longer so committed to that? And what does it mean if we're not? I want to wrap up with what I think is the most important lesson for someone studying foreign policy like myself and politics and looking at the end of World War II, is that the United States is able to change and change rapidly, not because of a single thinker or a single president, but because of the circumstances and challenges the people faced and the ability of Americans to put ideology aside and fundamentally change their institutions, shifting their anti-militarism, changing their doctrine, going from isolationism to internationalism, and changing their thoughts about the wider world. Americans were able to change their thinking to adjust to the challenges of their moment after World War II. They made a lot of mistakes. They did a lot of good things as well, and we can debate the balance between those. But there was a change in thinking, right? The fancy word we use as historians, there was a change in worldview among Americans. Ladies and gentlemen, that is possible again. And it does not have to be for worse. It does not have to be about our own navel-gazing. And please, it does not have to be about selfish xenophobia. We can see a wider world, and we can learn from the end of World War II how seeing and interacting with a wider world can make ourselves a better country. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to be here. I want to join my fellow panelists in expressing my appreciation for this great conference. I have learned so much already, and I look forward to the next couple days. Let's start. I'm going to shift our focus to the domestic United States, to the home front and thereafter. Well, the image you see in front of you was published in Life magazine on November 25th, 1946. It was entitled Family Utopia, and it reflected what the editors of Life claimed was, and I quote them, an honest representation of the dream of most US families, end quote. And they based this on consumer surveys and retail orders. Now, what's important here is not only all the stuff that we see pictured surrounding the biggest purchase of all, the suburban home, but also the implied message that the health of the post-war US economy would depend on Americans aspiring to consume. And that is indeed what happened. As the GDP, which I think you must all know is the standard measure of all the nation's goods and services, as it mushroomed from $103 billion in 1940 to almost $550 billion in 1960 to more than $25.5 trillion today, consumption share of GDP also kept growing. It went from 44% of GDP in 1940 before we entered the Second World War. Then it grew to 62% of GDP by 1960, to 66% by 2000. And it actually reached 69% in 2004, but it dipped after the Great Recession, and today it stands at 68% of GDP. So in other words, in the 21st century, about 2/3 of the American economy has consistently depended on private consumption. So the question before us today is, how did we get here? And to answer that, I think we have to go back in time to the 1930s and the 1940s, to the Great Depression and World War II. In general, the New Deal's approach to the Great Depression was experimental and improvisational, trying out various strategies, seeing what worked, abandoning what didn't. But over time, by the late 1930s, several commitments stuck, and those would shape, I think, the post-war United States. The first goal was to get people back to work and to pay them decently to stabilize the nation's capacity for consumption. At first, employment was provided through public works programs like the WPA and the CCC. And then there were two other New Deal initiatives that helped. First, the Wagner Act of 1935, which facilitated industrial unionization, thereby giving manufacturing workers the right to collective bargaining for job security, higher pay, and some benefits. And also the Social Security Act of 1935, which ensured that people would retire with some income security, thereby opening up jobs for the next generation, as well as facilitating increased consumption. And the second goal, by the late 1930s, was that American policymakers had come to embrace Keynesian economic thinking, which aimed at increasing aggregate demand in recessionary periods by priming the pump, using the fiscal tools of government spending and taxation to encourage greater consumer spending and thereby to encourage economic growth. Then if we turn to World War II, even before the US entered the war, I think you know the US was producing munitions and other materiel for our allies. In late 1940, FDR called for the US to serve as the arsenal of democracy. This gearing up of production led to higher employment. We went from an unemployment rate in 1932 when FDR came into office of 25% to 15% in 1939 to 1.2% in 1944. Also, there was much greater personal savings that accumulated over the war, And in general, we ended the war with a sense of overall recovery from the Great Depression. Then, when the US entered the war, there was even more ramping up of American productive capacity. Automobile plants, for example, retooled to churn out airplanes, engines, guns, cannons, and so forth. And I should mention here that the growth in manufacturing, combined with the drafting of able-bodied men, because there were women, but they weren't drafted, opened up jobs in war production for women and also for those who were previously left out of good manufacturing jobs, particularly African Americans. With the end of World War II in 1945, a number of factors converged to set the scene for post-war reconstruction. First, the US had full employment. Second, Americans had a large amount of savings, including in war bonds. By 1945, Americans were saving an average of 21% of their disposable income. Third, there was huge pent-up demand for products and much what we would call delayed gratification, as the home front had suffered from shortages and rationing of basic products like meat, sugar, gasoline, and so forth. And there was eagerness to start new families that were long delayed by depression and war, which led to what we call the baby boom. And I think there are many of us represented here today who come from that. As soldiers returned home and the nation's war footing returned to peacetime, several problems loomed in what was referred to as reconversion. There was an enormous housing shortage, and this was due to the fact that there had been very little construction of homes over the last 15 years. There was a need to transition from war production to producing for a peace economy. And there was fear that we would return to those high levels of unemployment as millions of men and women in uniform came home. And we might even relapse back into the Great Depression. Some of the solutions that, in fact, were arrived at include the GI Bill, which Jeremy mentioned, which promised veterans unemployment pay for up to a year. It was known as the 5220 Club. We guaranteed low-rate mortgages to buy homes. Tuition and subsistence assistance for education and training was supported by the GI Bill for those who took it, and support to start a business. And I would add here that this was a promise that all GIs saw fulfilled, but here African Americans who were eager to claim the GI Bill benefits in fact discovered that they did not necessarily find that they were open to them, and women were also discriminated against in GI benefits. Also, there was FHA-insured mortgages that were available to homeowners and to developers, and there was a major encouragement to individuals to consume, which even began during the war. You see here some of those encouragements. Note that the GI Bill, the GE ad, right there, it's a promise. And this other image here on the right was a post-war home show that was put on by contractors during the war. They both promoted the image of home as a single-family detached house in the suburbs. Now, to support that consumption, factories that had made tanks and planes were converted to making washing machines and refrigerators. And this is a cartoon that captures that. For example, Frigidaire, which was a division of General Motors, built machine guns and B-29 propellers during the war and then expanded to the appliance business after the war. Promoters of consumption worried that it might be hard to convince Americans to part with their hard-fought savings. So they encouraged spending much the way they had encouraged saving during the war, by linking it to patriotism. The post-war message was the good purchaser devoted to more, newer, and better was the good citizen. For example, Bride magazine's handbook for newlyweds told its readers, and I quote, When you buy the dozens of things you never bought or even thought of before, you are helping to build greater security for the industries of this country. What you buy is very vital to your new life and to our whole American way of living. Also operating was the belief that a mass consumption-oriented American society would help promote long-standing American ideals of democracy and equality. This photo spread from Life magazine in 1947 claimed that when Ted and Jean Hemeke purchased a new home on Long Island and new consumer durables to put in it, they were not only improving their own lives, but they were making possible a higher standard for all Americans. And this point was hammered home everywhere. Richard Nixon argued to Nikita Khrushchev in the famous kitchen debate in Moscow in 1959 that, and I quote, "The United States comes closest to the ideal of prosperity for all in a classless society," end quote. Even House Beautiful magazine asserted when it promoted the ranch-style house that, quote, "Our houses are all on one level, like our class structure," end quote. Now, government economists had made the case for how consumption spending would fuel a prosperous post-war economy during the war itself, arguing that it would stimulate production and employment. And you're seeing here a diagram from a New Deal economist named Robert Nathan, who wrote a book called Mobilizing for Abundance in 1944. And he shows how the cycle of starting with spending, with consumption, how that would fuel the American economy. Policymakers and businesses were not alone in promoting consumption as the best route to greater economic equality. Labor unions also promoted spending power as the key to promoting economic growth and full and more lucrative employment. I'm showing you here a cartoon from a CIO publication in 1946 that conveys the confidence that all interests will benefit if and when the purchasing power fuel tank is full. And I think that belief fueled labor's demands, like such things as negotiating for cost of living adjustments, or known as COLAs. Let me conclude with the question: how did this confidence in what I have called the consumer's republic, with its many promises of greater and more widespread prosperity and equality, work out in the long term? I have to be brief. There's a clock ticking here in my answer, but I would highlight a few things. To begin with, it led to an explosion of mass suburbia of private homes, particularly for the white middle class. From the start, most suburbs did not welcome African Americans, and they had a very hard time securing home financing. But even within the white experience, what began as mixed income suburbanization quickly became class stratified, with some suburbs offering that were better off with better services like schools than others. So the metropolitan landscape that emerged became increasingly racially and class segmented, offering people different opportunities for their lives. Moreover, the move of middle-class white consumers to the suburbs had serious consequences for American cities that they left behind. For example, many middle-class taxpayers exited, which had a huge impact on city revenues, and consumer spending increasingly shifted from urban downtowns to suburban shopping centers. At the end of World War II, there were only 8 shopping centers. By 1960, there were 3,840. This transition created many metropolitan areas where more wealth and investment was going to suburbs rather than to cities. In addition, as we've seen, domestic manufacturing, whoops, that was supposed to switch, okay. Domestic manufacturing was a key component of the thriving post-war economy. And that included military alongside consumer production, particularly during the Cold War with the growth of the so-called military-industrial complex. Over time, however, with major changes such as economic globalization and growing offshore production, American manufacturing has suffered, undermining the good jobs that once were an important part of Robert Nathan's concept of spending creates jobs and prosperity. Remember his closed circle. At first, American industry benefited from the widespread destruction of European and Japanese factories during the war. And in many cases, such as with steel, it cruised on, profiting without making the major investments in modernizing mills and factories that would keep the US competitive and American workers employed as Europe and Asia recovered. And of course, there are many other factors, such as automation, that contributed as well. For example, in 1965, the US automobile industry reached its peak of employment with 1 out of every 6 American jobs, 16.7%, related to the auto industry. And this is in contrast to today, where that figure is 1.7% of the US workforce. Taken together, along with some other crucial policy changes, such as a less progressive income tax structure in recent decades, the US has seen quite the opposite of what post-war consumer advocates promised, that a mass consumer-driven economy would deliver greater prosperity and equality to all Americans. Instead, we have seen inequality of incomes and wealth grow over the last half-century. So I would propose that today, consumption plays as important a role as ever in the nation's economy. Remember that 2/3 figure. But that this economy has failed to live up to the idealistic, egalitarian hopes of many founders of the Consumers' Republic. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, when I said we had an all-star panel, I meant we had an all-star panel. This is an extraordinary array of rich thinking and research that these 3 scholars have put before you. And we have a good 15 or maybe even just 18, 20 minutes for questions, and I want to hear from you all. My job as chair is to sort of say, what just happened? So 3 people can tie this all together. Eleanor Roosevelt and her idealism, Henry Kissinger and his sense that interests matter in order to pursue ideals, interests first, and John Maynard Keynes, who argued that consumption was the key to prosperity, which was the key to the survival, and indeed the greater widening the pie for everyone in a post-war economy. So Keynes, Kissinger, and Eleanor Roosevelt are not often put together in a single sort of concept, but this is a wonderful way of braiding together these threads that run through the post-war period and make it complex and sometimes contradictory. But these scholars have given us a wonderful entree into what makes the post-war period and its connections to the war so endlessly fascinating for scholars. So please, let's open it up to the floor, and Jeremy will identify the questioners.
Thank you very much to our panelists. If you please raise your hand, Connie and I will get to you. We'll start towards your right, towards the back.
Dr. Cook, was Eleanor ever happy with Franklin's response to her advocacy?
I think FDR was always grateful that Eleanor took some of the things that he was very slow to deal with forward. They disagreed about many things. When he crashed the economic, in 1936, he crashed the Economic Forum of Many Nations, and Eleanor Roosevelt wrote 20 articles attacking that. He never protested. In fact, I think it's true to say FDR needed Eleanor Roosevelt, especially on issues of race and justice and freedom, and we see how much he needed her, I think, more vigorously now than ever, as we need her more vigorously now than ever.
Would you say she could say things in public that he couldn't? She certainly could and did, but I mean, did he think of it that way?
You know, one of the things that shocked me is that he would take things to his allies in Congress who were the Dixiecrats and ask them what they thought. And if they thought, no, no, don't do that, he wouldn't do it. And that's very shocking.
Right, right.
So he's not the leader that we thought he was.
Yeah, yeah.
Next question is all the way to your left, halfway back, please.
Yes, thank you. I've been an investment advisor to families and individuals for the last 55 years. So I've lived through every type of inflation, market downturns, military situations, and we've been able to get through these many decades together and recover. However, going forward, I am now analyzing what I see out there as a scenario that I'm very uncomfortable with. And that is starting with a dry subject, but it's called demographics. And demographics, they say, is not destiny, but I think it combined with the downturn of demographics in the United States, in China in particular, Japan, and you combine that with the debt levels that each one of these countries has and the future entitlements, the financial reality, which always comes in. I'm struggling with how to deal with all of these factors and concern maybe, and one of the arguments now for China is that because of they actually see their demographic downturn, that they are the most dangerous at this time militarily. So I'm trying to struggle with all these different areas.
I don't know if anyone wants to use that as a jumping off platform. Elizabeth?
No, it is very striking that in the period we're talking about, people were very worried about population explosion. And we certainly have a very different reality today. I mean, the US is even better off in some ways than a lot of our other countries that are barely replacing their own population. And I think the concerns about immigration that exist in many, many countries is also a factor. We've always been a country that has brought population here, and that has increased our size. But it is an interesting point, and it does have a bearing on this dynamic of depending on consumption and consumer markets to keep an economy viable. And I think the Chinese are now actually struggling with that to some extent, where, you know, they were really riding high with, you know, as the country was increasing its wealth and people were consuming their own goods and they were starting to produce for their own markets, not just for the rest of the world. So I think they may be going through some of what we have been through in this country.
Yeah, I would just build on that a little bit to say that I think you're right to be worried, but I think the way to think about it is to think about which countries have access to future capabilities and resources. And just to build on what Liz was saying, throughout our history, one of our great strengths has been immigration, right? The people who come in. I'm biased. I'm the child of immigrants. You know, my mother's family fled the Holocaust. My father fled famine in India. And here I am. I'm still confused. But here's the point, right? Throughout our history, our demographics have served to our advantage in almost every era because we've been able to either produce our own or import talent. And you certainly know this. Step on any university, any of our universities today, look at the talent that's recruited to our country by our universities, and look at what that does for virtually every field of study, from artificial intelligence through history and the social sciences. And so it seems to me we control our destiny if we are willing to adopt immigration policies that allow us to bring in a new generation of highly productive workers who will not only grow the economy and bring consumption into our society to a higher level, but also will ultimately be the ones who pay off the debt. That's how it's been done before. And so I'm not concerned about the inherent demographic circumstances. I'm concerned more about policymakers recognizing and understanding that history. We have not had a new immigration bill since the 1980s. Ronald Reagan was the last president to sign immigration legislation. That's embarrassing. That's shameful. And that's a bipartisan shame, I would say.
If I could just add on one thought that you have inspired. This is going to sound like a a provocative statement, but I'm going to say it anyway. One lesson of the Second World War, and in fact of the New Deal and the Depression era and the Second World War, is that the American government demonstrated it has the capacity to solve really big problems when it is motivated to do so.
Yes.
And I think, you know, we have one of the strange inversions of the post-war period is that we've come to believe that government is the problem and that government has to get out of the way for social problems to be solved. This is an article of faith for many, but at least in the era of the Depression and the Second World War, it was the government that led and helped Americans solve the domestic as well as the global problems of that era. So should we take some inspiration from it? Should we use it as a model? I don't know what, but it's just a fact that the government had to expand first and then tackle some of these enormous problems. It can do so again. To Jeremy's point, we can learn how to do that kind of thing again. All right, another question.
We'll go to the center towards the front.
Got this light right here. It's right here. No.
Dr. Cohen, in your wonderful book, Making a New Deal, which I read 30 years ago and still remember, you made the point that strong unions helped not only different classes, but different races. And I'm wondering, I grew up in Detroit, and UAW was big then, but I understand that even auto unions are having auto plants are having a hard time unionizing in some parts of the country. And I just would like your opinion. How many do you believe like a strong union throughout the country would make for a better increase in salaries and therefore maybe increase consumption? And could you talk a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, but thank you for that question. I made some notes to myself in case somebody asked me why the Consumers' Republic unraveled. And there are a number of things that I would point to, including some I mentioned, the growth of offshore manufacturing, the tax changes structure that I mentioned. But I did include in that list the decline of unions, because I do think that strong unions actually led to people, it fed this whole system and that cycle, because people were making good money, they felt they were middle class, that they could lead a good life, that their children could go on and have even better lives. And I think that was very healthy for this country. Now, you mentioned the UAW and the auto industry. I mean, you're asking this question, though, of course, on a rare moment when the UAW actually was quite successful in its new contract with the auto industry, looking ahead to electric vehicles and trying to protect jobs. But ultimately, and I think that the Biden administration and I think the industry itself recognized that its dependence on committed workers who would be able to keep America, keep the United States in the forefront of world production in automobiles. And there is going to be a big revolution coming in the kind of automobiles we drive. And are we going to be at the center of that, or is China going to be? And so, I think that there was a vested interest that the auto industry had in actually responding to the UAW demands. And so I feel like unions are basically good for the country. To have decently paid workers ultimately makes the system work better.
Great. I'm seeing some. Nick is up here at the very front.
We've got a question from Nick in the front to your right.
Yes, just a comment maybe to all of you. If you look at World War II and coming out of the Great Depression and being outnumbered by our enemies 20-1, and how we able to learn faster than our enemies and faster than our allies. At the end of the day, the democracies prevailed for the most part, except for our alliance with Stalin and Soviet Russia, but the British and the Americans, certainly led by America. So you'd have to say that at the end of the war, the system of democracy, that is the system, came through and proved to be better than the systems that everybody thought was better before the war, that is either communism or fascism, were the forces of the future and the systems of the future. And then coming after the war, now you have what we've learned from all of you here today, and especially the explosion of higher education, the GI Bill, and the investment of the National Defense Education Act. I mean, you put those two things together, and the government invested in that tremendously, and it led to an explosion of knowledge of science and technology, and kept us on the cutting edge as a superpower for all of the rest of the century. And so I'm wondering today, now it costs $50,000 a semester to go to college, as Jeremi just said, or a year. So it's a very wealthy.
Per semester at Yale.
That's per semester, okay. In those days, it was totally paid for by the GI Bill, and at the same time, you're investing in research and technology and defense industries and languages and culture, and it was the greatest explosion of knowledge in American history and probably world history. Those supports and those investments are gone now, and are we losing the edge because of the lack of investments that the government was making in those areas, in education and science and research and technology, compared to what we did after World War II?
Before the panel responds, then we'll wrap up. I'll just say that Eisenhower is one of the guys that pulls all that together, of course, because he's the leader in the Second World War, but he's also responsible for this huge investment in scientific education and universities. So, you know, he's one of those hinge figures who imagines a post-war America building on its successes in the war and proving that democracy can fulfill its capacity for progress, for a better nation. So he's a fascinating, so it's one of the reasons that Eisenhower, his stock has gone up so much over the last half century, because he looks increasingly as if he was responding to some of the crises we're facing. Anyone want to
thank you for a very good comment, I think, and it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because I'm now involved in a project looking at the experience and impact of deindustrialization in the United States. And what I'm seeing are, as a result of what I actually talked about, of the unevenness of education and the quality of people's, kind of the experience that they have based on where they live. Our country has forever left education to the local level. You know that, you pay your property taxes, you move into a community based on the quality of its schools. But we end up in many places with people who are very undereducated. So for example, in spending time in Youngstown, Ohio, I see high unemployment rates, and then people saying we don't have enough workers who can work with the sophistication of current manufacturing, which demands tremendous ability to work with technology and computers and so forth. So if we're going to talk about what's needed today, perhaps by government, to in fact raise the quality of life for Americans, I would say we do need to intervene in education, and not just at the post-secondary level, but also at the secondary level, because of the unevenness in people's education.
Yeah, you can each.
I think it's really important to realize there's a war against education right now. Even in New York State, CUNY and SUNY are under attack. People want to defund public higher education. And there has been across the country the defunding of local boards of education and school districts. So I'm not sure what's behind this. I think we look at, people are talking about the danger of fascism, and I think this is very real. But if you look at the war against public higher education, it is a very scary and creepy thing, and we're in the middle of the war, the backlash.
Last word, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think the premise of your question, Nick, is spot on, right? I would just say three things quickly, each of which is worth a whole conversation, right? First, the defunding of education, which has happened across the board, especially higher ed. I'll just give you some quick statistics, right? All the leading public universities, University of Texas, Wisconsin, Berkeley, Michigan, they were all just 30 years ago, their budgets were more than 50% covered by the state. Now it's less than 10% for all of them, less than 10%. So there's been a significant defunding. For a while, before spending was cut on prisons, each of those states was spending almost as much on prisons as it was on universities. What that has meant is not only that there's less money available for those who don't have money who are going to university, and sometimes less money for research, it also means that these universities have become de facto privatized. So the University of Texas, where I am, we're fortunate. We actually have either the second largest or the largest endowment in the world, if you think how you measure it, right? But that's private money, and that's oil money. And that distorts the way that we do things, right? A public university is committed to research of public value. So that's one thing. We have to think about the funding stream. Secondly, universities have become, in the social media age, and this precedes it also, as Blanche was pointing to, they become easy whipping boys for politicians who want to score points. It's not to say there aren't problems with universities, but I will tell you, more than 20 years teaching at the University of Wisconsin and the University of Texas, two leading public universities, I have every year confronted legislators criticizing us. Never once have they come to campus. Never once have they come to campus. So there's no real effort to solve problems that I've seen from state legislators, and we have problems. It's an effort simply to score points in class politics and various other things. I don't think that Eisenhower's generation did that. I might be, creating a kind of halcyon day, but I think they valued higher education enough to know not to do that. Today we have people like the junior senator in Texas who actually graduated from the leading universities in the country, has benefited from that, and then spends his entire career going out attacking those universities. And he's found a way to convert that into his own personal value. I think that would be an anathema to the Eisenhower World War II generation. And then the third and the final point I'll make that I think is actually really significant, it's that universities have become internationalized now. To do the serious work we do, we are in international dialogue. We're collaborating with people all around the world. And back to my point about immigration, our national policies now make that very difficult. I can't tell you the number of students we graduate at the University of Texas, and I'm sure it's true in other universities, who graduate, want to stay in the United States, and are forced to leave. These are highly talented people that we've invested in, and they're forced to leave because of our, shall we say, not well-adjusted employment immigration policies, right? So we have to adjust that area of our world if we're going to make our universities connect to the needs of our society.
Well, to put it in a nutshell, America once did great things, and we can do so again, but we got to get going. I want to, if you could please give the panel a warm round of applause.